London. The evening rain was streaming down the windows, blurring the silhouettes of passers-by. In a small cafe on the outskirts, a coffee machine hummed softly, and the smell of lemon cake mingled with the damp air. A man in a checkered shirt with a baseball cap pulled down over his eyes chose a table by the window and ordered coffee. No one knew it was Elon Musk, and that in a few minutes, one ordinary girl in this cafe would make a choice that would change everything. The evening rain drizzled over London, tracing silver lines down the glass windows of Old Street Brew, a small cafe nestled between brick buildings on a quiet street. Inside, the scent of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the faint aroma of baked goods, creating a comforting contrast to the damp chill outside. The cafe wasn't particularly crowded, just a few regulars scattered at their usual tables, flipping through newspapers or scrolling absent-mindedly on their phones. At the counter, Liana worked with the efficiency of someone who had spent too many hours in the same spot, her fingers automatically reaching for cups, tapping in orders, and exchanging polite smiles. It was just another evening, another shift she would forget as soon as it ended. She barely noticed when the door opened, the small bell chiming softly above. A man walked in, shaking droplets of rain from the brim of his cap. He moved with the air of someone used to blending in, his attire carefully unremarkable, dark jeans, a checkered shirt, a simple jacket. He scanned the cafe briefly, his gaze lingering for just a second on the quietest table near the window before making his way over. Liana finally glanced up when he approached the counter. "Black coffee, and whatever pastry you recommend." His voice was calm, low but steady, with a kind of natural ease. She gave a nod, barely registering the face beneath the cap, and turned to prepare his order. A moment later, a cup of steaming black coffee and a slice of lemon cake were placed on a tray, sliding toward him with practiced precision. The man took his seat near the window, where the rain continued its slow descent down the glass. He didn't pull out his phone, didn't glance around nervously like someone expecting to be recognized. He simply wrapped his hand around the cup, watching the city outside, lost in thoughts that had nothing to do with the place he was in. The cafe hummed with its usual quiet energy. The low murmur of conversations blended with the soft jazz playing in the background. The regulars carried on, as always, the routine of their lives unbroken. And then, the door opened again. A gust of cold air slipped inside, followed by 3 men. They moved with the casual arrogance of those who had no reason to rush, their boots heavy against the wooden floor. The leader, a tall man with sharp features and a leather jacket that had seen better days, let his eyes sweep over the room. He wasn't looking for coffee. His name was Max, and when his gaze landed on the man by the window, something shifted in his expression. Liana noticed it instantly, the small, almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers curled slightly into fists. She had seen that look before, the look of someone who carried a grudge. Max didn't walk straight to the counter. He took his time, stopping near the window, tilting his head slightly as if studying the man sitting there. Still, the stranger didn't move. The cafe carried on, oblivious to the way the atmosphere had thickened. Liana reached for a cloth, wiping down the counter with slow, measured movements, her eyes flicking up just enough to catch the way Max leaned in slightly. A moment passed, then another, and then Max reached out. He didn't touch the man. Instead, his hand closed around the small plate on the table, lifting the slice of lemon cake between 2 fingers, inspecting it like it was some foreign object. Liana froze. The stranger finally looked up. His gaze met Max's, calm, unreadable, steady. There was no sign of fear, no tension in his shoulders. He merely watched. Max exhaled through his nose, a slow, deliberate sound. Then he turned the pastry in his fingers, as if considering whether it was worth eating. The cafe was still moving around them, but something had changed. The air felt heavier. Liana could already feel it. The moment before something cracked, before the world inside these 4 walls shifted into something else. She had been in this position before. She knew what was coming. And still, she wasn't sure she could stop it. The cafe carried on as if nothing had changed, as if the tension near the window was just another unnoticed ripple in the quiet rhythm of the evening. The soft jazz hummed through the speakers. The clinking of cups and murmured conversations continued, but the air between the two men had thickened into something almost tangible. Max rolled the piece of cake between his fingers, slow and deliberate, as if testing how far he could stretch the silence before it snapped. His lips curled slightly, but his eyes stayed cold, calculating. The stranger didn't react. He merely held his cup, fingers steady around the ceramic, his posture unchanged. There was something unsettling about his calmness, something that made the moment drag longer than it should have. Liana felt it before she fully understood it. That instinct, sharp and undeniable, the moment before things turned bad. It wasn't about the cake, not really. It never was. People like Max didn't pick fights over something so trivial. They picked fights because they needed control, because they needed to remind everyone around them that they were the ones who dictated how things would go. She kept her hands busy, cleaning a perfectly spotless counter, listening without looking. Max had always been like this, too proud, too quick to assert dominance, always carrying around an invisible grudge. He didn't usually come to this cafe, but she had seen his kind before, the kind that walked into a place and expected the room to shift around them, the kind that took what they wanted just to see if anyone would dare stop them. The stranger still hadn't moved, hadn't reacted. He simply sat there, watching, waiting. It was Max who broke the silence first, though not with words. He let the cake drop back onto the plate with a soft thud, tilting his head slightly, studying the man in front of him. There was a beat of stillness, the kind that stretches too long, that makes every nerve tighten in anticipation. Then, as if nothing had happened, Max straightened, brushing his hands off on his jeans, leaving behind a faint dusting of crumbs. Liana almost thought it was over. But then Max reached forward again, this time resting his palm flat against the table, leaning in slightly. Not touching, not quite invading personal space, but making sure the presence of his body felt like a weight pressing into the moment. Still, the stranger didn't react. And that, she realized, was the problem. Max wasn't used to being ignored. He was used to people responding, to fear, to aggression, to some kind of acknowledgement of the unspoken challenge he laid out before them. The lack of response was worse than resistance. It was indifference, and Max hated indifference. The cafe was too quiet now. Some of the regulars had picked up on the shift in atmosphere, their voices softer, their glances more cautious. A man in the corner stirred his coffee without drinking it. A woman near the door reached for her bag, like she was considering leaving. But no one said anything. Liana clenched her jaw. She had seen situations like this play out before. Maybe not here, maybe not exactly like this, but close enough. The moment before things turned sharp. The moment before a slow, steady slide into something irreversible. Max's fingers tapped against the table, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, the stranger moved. It wasn't much, just a small shift, setting his cup down with quiet precision. But it was enough to make Max's eyes narrow slightly, enough to show that this man wasn't just sitting there because he was oblivious. He was waiting. The realization made something flicker in Max's gaze, something close to amusement, but not quite. He glanced toward his friends, who had been standing nearby, watching, waiting for the inevitable escalation. They didn't say anything, but their body language had already changed, shoulders squared, feet planted just slightly wider. Liana knew she had to do something. She didn't want to, but she couldn't just stand there, either. Her fingers tightened around the cloth she was holding, her heartbeat picking up just enough for her to notice. She wasn't afraid, not exactly. But she knew what happened when people like Max didn't get the reaction they wanted. She knew how quickly things could spiral. She took a breath, steadying herself, and stepped out from behind the counter. Not too fast. Not too aggressive, just enough to remind everyone that there were other people here, that this wasn't some empty alley where things could go unnoticed. She kept her voice even. If you're not ordering anything, you should probably let the man finish his coffee. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't a demand. Just a statement of fact, calm and measured. Max's head turned slowly. For a second, no one spoke. Then, something in his expression shifted, just slightly, just enough for her to recognize it. That flicker of amusement, the kind that meant he was enjoying this, that he wasn't taking it seriously. And that, somehow, was worse. He let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, before pushing off the table, straightening his posture. Then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that promised something unspoken, the kind that carried the weight of something unfinished. Liana knew that meant this wasn't over. Not yet. The moment passed, but the weight of it lingered. The cafe carried on, the hum of voices slowly returning, the clink of cups resuming as if nothing had happened. But the tension hadn't gone. It settled in the air like the lingering scent of something burnt, faint but unmistakable. Max didn't leave, not entirely. He stepped back, letting the moment breathe, letting the illusion of normalcy return. His friends stayed where they were, their eyes moving between him and the man at the window. They weren't finished. Not yet. The stranger picked up his cup again, moving with the same measured ease, taking a sip as though nothing had disrupted his evening. That, more than anything, seemed to pull at the edges of Max's patience. Liana had seen enough fights to recognize the dangerous kind. The ones that weren't just about words, that weren't just about dominance. They were about proving something. And when a man like Max felt challenged, even by silence, he wouldn't let it go. She stayed behind the counter this time, forcing herself to keep moving, to keep up the illusion that everything was fine. She wiped down a tray that didn't need cleaning, her hands steady, her mind racing. Much hadn't left. He was circling, waiting, looking for an opening. The man at the window still hadn't given him one. And that, she knew, was what made this worse. Max wasn't used to being ignored. He was used to being feared, or at least acknowledged. But the stranger hadn't so much as flinched, hadn't given him the satisfaction of a reaction. It was a quiet kind of defiance, the kind that needed no words. And Max hated that. He turned away briefly, heading toward the counter. His hands were loose at his sides, casual, controlled. But there was something about his movements, something deliberate, something that made Liana's stomach tighten. She met his gaze when he reached the counter. He didn't order, didn't say anything at first, just drummed his fingers against the wood, slow and rhythmic. And then, finally, "That guy back there," Max murmured, tilting his head slightly toward the window. "Seems real comfortable. You know him?" Liana didn't answer right away. She could feel the eyes of the cafe on them, could feel the quiet tension from the people who had seen what was happening but pretended not to. She kept her voice even. "He's a customer, just like everyone else." Muck smiled, a slow, knowing smile, like he'd expected that answer. "Right, just a customer." His fingers tapped again, thoughtful. "Funny, doesn't look like he belongs here." Liana didn't react. She knew what he was doing. She'd seen it before. The way people like him tried to pick at something, chip away at the edges until they found a weakness. Max leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough that only she could hear. "You think he's better than us?" She didn't flinch, but he must have seen the way her hands stilled. His smile widened. "I know his type," he said, his voice smooth. "They walk into places like this, pretending they're just like the rest of us. But they're not. They never will be." Liana exhaled slowly. She wasn't sure if he was talking to her anymore or himself. He straightened, glancing back at the window, at the man who still hadn't reacted, still hadn't acknowledged the weight of the moment pressing down on the cafe. Then, as if reaching a decision, Max turned and walked straight back toward the stranger's table. Liana's breath caught. She didn't move, but she wanted to. Something was about to break. Max stopped just short of the table, standing there for a moment, watching, waiting. The stranger set his cup down again, finally meeting Max's gaze. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't even guarded. Just steady. Max tilted his head. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached for the coffee cup. He didn't throw it, didn't knock it over, just picked it up, lifted it slightly, as if testing its weight. And then, just as deliberately, he let it drop. The ceramic hit the table with a dull clink, then tipped over, spilling dark liquid across the wood, seeping toward the edge. A slow, creeping silence fell over the cafe. No one moved. No one spoke. The stranger exhaled quietly, barely audible. Then he took a napkin, unfolded it with deliberate patience, and began to wipe the table. That was the moment everything shifted, because Max had expected something else. Anger, resistance, some kind of reaction, but all he got was quiet, and that somehow was worse. The tension snapped like a wire stretched too thin. Max moved. It was subtle at first, just a shift in weight, but Liana saw it coming before it happened. He reached out, fast, sharp, grabbing the edge of the stranger's jacket. The cafe inhaled as one. For the first time, the stranger reacted, not in panic, not in fear, just movement, fluid, practice, controlled. His hand came up, closing over Max's wrist with precision, with a kind of calm that spoke of familiarity, of knowing exactly how much pressure to apply without making a scene. Max froze. It was only for a second, but it was enough. The stranger let go first. Max stepped back, his face unreadable, his breathing controlled but just slightly uneven. And then, the door opened. A gust of cold air swept in, and with it, the sharp, unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps. Liana's gaze flicked toward the entrance. Two figures stepped inside. Not regulars. Not customers. Police. Someone had called them. Max exhaled through his nose, slow and measured. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. His friends followed. The cafe stayed silent long after they were gone. The cafe remained still long after the door swung shut behind Max and his friends. The sound of the rain outside, the occasional rustling of coats, the clinking of spoons against porcelain, it all felt muted, as if the entire space had been wrapped in invisible tension. The presence of the two officers standing near the entrance only added to the weight pressing down on the air. The stranger, still seated at his table, moved slowly, finishing what little was left of cleaning up the spilled coffee. He didn't acknowledge the lingering stares, didn't shift in his seat or glance around as if waiting for something. Instead, he acted as though nothing significant had just happened, as if the confrontation hadn't even registered. That, more than anything, unsettled the remaining patrons. Liana exhaled quietly, feeling her shoulders loosen just slightly. The worst of it was over, but the feeling that something had fundamentally shifted in the atmosphere of the cafe remained. She turned back toward the counter, moving on instinct, reaching for a fresh towel to clean up the spill properly. Her hands were steady, but her mind was still racing. The older officer, a man in his late 50s with graying hair and a look that suggested he had seen this kind of thing too many times before, took a few steps forward, surveying the room. His gaze briefly landed on Liana, then drifted to the stranger at the window. The younger officer, far less composed, shifted awkwardly, his fingers twitching near his belt as if expecting some kind of instruction. No one spoke. The cafe had returned to its quiet hum, but the silence between those who had witnessed the event was thick with unspoken thoughts. Liana finally moved toward the stranger's table. The spill had already been mostly contained by his napkin, but she reached down anyway, methodically wiping the remaining liquid from the wood. He let her, not moving his hands out of the way, not offering any sign of acknowledgement. She knew better than to ask if he was all right. Instead, she spoke just loud enough for only him to hear. "They're watching you." It wasn't a question. The stranger finally looked up, his expression as unreadable as ever. He didn't turn toward the officers, didn't shift uncomfortably under their gaze. If anything, he seemed entirely indifferent to their presence, the same way he had been indifferent to Max's provocations. Liana knew better than to mistake that for a lack of awareness. The older officer finally spoke, addressing the cafe as a whole rather than any one person. His voice was calm, practiced. "Is there an issue here we should be aware of?" The silence stretched. No one answered immediately. Liana glanced toward the handful of customers who remained. Some avoided eye contact, suddenly invested in their drinks. Others exchanged brief looks, waiting for someone else to speak first. It was the man in the corner, the same one who had discreetly made the call, who finally cleared his throat. "Some guys came in, caused trouble. That's all." The older officer nodded slowly, as if he had expected as much. His gaze flickered toward Liana. "You work here?" She hesitated, then nodded. He studied her for a moment, then shifted his focus back to the stranger. "And you?" The stranger lifted his cup, took a slow sip, then set it down again. "Just a customer." His voice was calm, measured. It wasn't an evasion, it was simply a fact. The officer waited, perhaps expecting more, but when nothing followed, he exhaled through his nose and turned slightly toward the counter. "We got a call about a disturbance," he said, this time directing his words at Liana. "Is there anything that needs to be reported?" She knew what he was asking. She also knew the answer they both understood, but wouldn't say out loud. If she reported Max, if she gave the police a reason to go after him, this wouldn't be over. Max wasn't the type to let something like that slide. And Liana had seen enough to know that the kind of people he surrounded himself with didn't just walk away from slight. She thought of the way he had smiled before leaving, that quiet promise of unfinished business. "No," she said finally, voice even. "Nothing happened." The officer studied her for a moment, weighing her response. Then, with a nod that was neither approval nor dismissal, he stepped back. "If anything changes, you let us know." He didn't need to specify what he meant. The officers exchanged a glance, then made their way toward the door. As they left, the younger one hesitated slightly before following, as if waiting for something to shift, for something else to be said. But nothing was. The door shut behind them, and the cafe breathed again. Liana turned back to the counter, still gripping the towel, pressing it against the wood as if she could scrub away the tension that lingered. She didn't know why, but she suddenly felt exhausted. The stranger finished the last sip of his coffee, then set the cup down, the small clink against the saucer seeming louder than it should have been. For a moment, he sat there, unmoving. Then, as if nothing at all had happened, he pushed back his chair, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a few bills. He set them down next to the plate, sliding them just slightly toward her side of the table before standing. Liana watched as he adjusted his jacket, glanced briefly toward the window where the rain had begun to let up, then finally met her gaze again. There was no thank you, no lingering words or explanations, just a small nod. Then he walked out. Liana stayed where she was, her fingers still pressed against the counter, the damp towel cooling in her grip. She didn't move until the door shut behind him. And even then, she couldn't quite shake the feeling that nothing was over yet. The cafe settled back into routine, but the air still carried something heavy, something unspoken. Conversations resumed, cups clinked, chairs shifted, but it was different. The regulars who had witnessed the confrontation stole occasional glances toward the door, as if expecting someone to walk back in. Others, those who had come in after, noticed the tension without knowing why. It was the kind of quiet that clung to a place after something significant had happened, something just beneath the surface. Liana moved with mechanical precision, wiping down tables, refilling sugar containers, making sure everything appeared as normal as possible. It was the only way she knew how to push forward, to keep moving, keep working, keep pretending nothing had changed. But something had. She could still feel the imprint of it, the way Max had stood too close, the way the stranger had refused to react, the way the police had lingered just long enough to remind everyone that this wasn't over. Even though Max had left, she knew what that look in his eyes had meant. It was a warning, and warnings from people like him were never empty. She had made a choice tonight, not just to speak, not just to step in, but to lie to the officers, to brush it under the rug, to act as if nothing was worth reporting. She had done it without hesitation, but now, hours later, she couldn't stop the thoughts from creeping in. Would Max be back? Had she made it worse by interfering? Would this place, her job, her daily routine, now carry the weight of an unfinished confrontation? She didn't regret standing up for the stranger, but she wasn't naive enough to think that people like Max walked away so easily. The shift dragged into closing time, each tick of the clock feeling longer than usual. A few of the regulars had stayed later than normal, as if waiting to see if anything else would happen. When it became clear that nothing would, not tonight, they gathered their coats, murmured quiet goodbyes, and disappeared into the London rain. Liana locked the door behind them, turning the sign to closed, then exhaled, pressing her forehead against the cool glass for just a moment. The street outside was nearly empty now. The puddles reflected the glow of the streetlights, fractured and rippling with each drop of lingering rain. She stayed like that for longer than she should have, her thoughts circling, looping back to the same worries, the same unresolved weight in her chest. Then she turned, flicking off the main lights, leaving only the dim glow of the back room. She needed to finish cleaning before she could go home, needed to distract herself, needed something to hold on to that wasn't the gnawing unease of knowing that tonight had been a shift in something larger than just her evening routine. She moved through the space with practiced efficiency, stacking chairs, wiping counters, checking the register. But as she reached the counter, she noticed something that made her pause. The cash. The money the stranger had left sat untouched on the table, neatly placed, unmoved since he had set it down. But there was something else. A card. Small, simple, with no logo, no flourish. Just a name. She reached for it hesitantly, her fingers brushing the edge before flipping it over. One line, printed in clean, sharp lettering. Tesla Foundation, Social Impact Division. Her breath caught. The name beneath, it was his. He had left without a word, without explanation. But this was something deliberate. Liana turned the card over again, half expecting there to be more, some kind of message, some kind of instruction. But there wasn't. Just the implication, the silent offer left in place of the words he hadn't said. Her fingers curled around the edges. This wasn't just a tip. It was a door, a choice. For a long time, she simply stood there, the quiet hum of the empty cafe pressing around her, the weight of the night finally settling in. She thought of Max. She thought of the way fear dictated so much in places like this, the way people let things slide because it was easier, safer. She thought of the way she had swallowed down the instinct to back away, to let someone else handle it, and how despite everything, she hadn't been able to. She thought of the stranger, of the way he had refused to be pulled into the game Max had set before him, of the way he had met every unspoken threat with silence, with patience, with something unshakable. And then she thought of herself, the cafe, the routine, the life she had built, one carefully measured step at a time. And now, in the palm of her hand, something unexpected, a way out, a way forward. Liana exhaled, slow and steady, then slid the card into her pocket. Tomorrow, she would make a decision. But tonight, she allowed herself the quiet moment of knowing. Something had changed, and there was no going back.